The summer of 1935 did not arrive in Coldwater Flats so much as it descended heavy and merciless, like a hand pressing down on the flat Texas panhandle until the earth cracked and the sky turned the color of old bone. The land out here had never been generous. It demanded everything and promised nothing. But that summer it felt as though even the promise of tomorrow had been quietly withdrawn, leaving only the heat, the dust, and the silence of things left undone. Cora Holloway was 18 years old and she was alone. She had been alone for 2 months now. 2 months since the fever had taken her father, Walter Holloway, in the small hours of a May morning when the mockingbirds were still singing and the world outside seemed indifferent to the fact that a good man was leaving it. The doctor had come from Amarillo, but he had come too late, arriving in the late afternoon to find Walter already gone and Cora sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has already passed through the worst of it alone. The neighbors had come just in time for the burial, bringing their black clothes and their careful expressions and their casseroles wrapped in dish towels. And then, as was the custom of small towns, when the spectacle of grief had run its course, they had gone home to their own lives and left Cora to the silence of the homestead. The condolences had lasted about a week, the casseroles a few days longer, and then the quiet had settled in like the dust itself, fine, pervasive, inescapable, finding its way into every room and every hour regardless of what she did to keep it out. Walter Holloway had not been a man who made much noise in the world. He was a farmer in the way that stone is a stone, without pretense, without apology, shaped entirely by what the land and weather had done to him over 67 years of hard living on the Texas Panhandle. His hands were the kind of hands that told a man's whole story, say, across the knuckle scarred at the palm with calluses built up over decades of work that left the skin thick as leather and the grip still capable of cracking walnuts well into his 60s. He had spoken rarely and listened carefully, which most people in Coldwater Flats mistook for slowness. It was not slowness, it was something closer to vigilance, the steady, patient attention of a man who understood that the world communicated most clearly to those willing to be quiet enough to hear it. Cora had inherited his eyes, that pale, watchful gray that seemed to register everything without betraying much, and his silences which she now found herself inhabiting in a way that was both comforting and frightening. She moved through the homestead the way he had, deliberately, without wasted motion, checking things out of habit, even when there was nothing left to check. She inspected the fences at the same hours he had. She read the sky at dusk from the same spot near the eastern pasture fence where he had stood every evening of her childhood. She made her coffee the same way, in the same battered tin pot, and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn. The land was hers now. The house, the fields that hadn't produced much in 3 years of drought, and the barn, that great weathered structure that sat at the far edge of the property like a cathedral, with the religion beaten out of it, its boards silvered by decades of sun and wind, its roof patched in 3 places with tin that had gone rust-colored at the edges. It was a Saturday morning in late July when Cora finally walked out to the barn to begin the work she had been postponing for 2 months. She had told herself it was because she wasn't ready. That was true in the way that many painful things are true, partially, incompletely, leaving out the part that matters most. The fuller truth was that the barn belonged to Walter in a way the house did not. The house was where he had slept and eaten and occasionally spoken a complete sentence. The barn was where he had lived, where he had moved through his days with a purposefulness and a kind of contained vitality that the house never seemed to draw from him. She could feel his presence in the barn the moment she pulled open the heavy double doors and stood in the flooding light of the entrance. The smell of him in the walls and the floor and the air itself, the arrangement of tools and rope and old equipment that was entirely his, the particular weight of the atmosphere inside that she had no word for except his. Flint was already there, sitting at the threshold as though he had been waiting for her. He was a big dog, a shepherd mix with a coat the color of charcoal and amber, and eyes that were almost disturbingly attentive. the kind of eyes that make a person feel observed rather than merely seen. He had been Walter's dog in the way that certain animals choose certain people, not through training or circumstance, but through some deeper alignment of temperament that runs below the level of decision. Since Walter's death, Flint had taken to sleeping outside the barn rather than in the house, as though standing watch over the old man's territory, as though the keeping of it were a responsibility he had assumed without being asked. Now he looked up at Cora with those clear amber eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling that he understood more about what this morning meant than she did. "All right," she said quietly, "let's get it done." She started with the heaviest work first, the way Walter had taught her, without ever framing it as a lesson. Visible progress early in the day kept you honest about the hours ahead. It prevented the particular self-deception of rearranging small things and calling it productivity. The barn was vast and cluttered with decades of accumulated life coils of old rope hanging from iron hooks, rusted harnesses draped over wooden rails, wooden crates stacked to the rafters with no apparent system, a hand plow that hadn't moved in years and had begun to look like part of the floor, canning jars clouded with age and disuse. Every item was a decision she wasn't ready to make. Keep or surrender, hold or let go. She understood moving through it that her reluctance to come out here had not been entirely about grief. Some of it had been about this, the weight of all these choices, the responsibility of deciding what was worth carrying forward. She kept moving, which was the only defense she had against the weight. The morning wore on. Flint dozed near the open doors, one ear always turned toward the interior, tracking her movements by sound in his sleep. The light shifted as it climbed, pouring down through the gaps in the rough boards, in long angled columns full of swirling reddish dust that caught the sunlight and held it the way the panhandle air always held dust intimately, as though it belonged there, as though dust were the natural state of things, and clean air merely a temporary interruption. She worked steadily without music or conversation, which was fine because she had neither. She worked the way Walter had worked, without commentary, without the need to narrate the effort to herself or anyone else. She moved things. She assessed things. She made the small, irreversible decisions about what was beyond saving and what still had use left in it. She did not cry, which surprised her a little. She had cried at the burial and twice in the week that followed, but out here doing his work, in his space, the grief arranged itself differently, less like a wound and more like a weight she was learning to carry in a way that didn't slow her down. It was around mid-morning that she came to the feed bin. It sat in the far northeastern corner of the barn, half hidden behind a collapsed shelf and several broken wooden pallets that had been stacked against the wall in no particular order, as though deposited there and forgotten. The bin itself was a large, iron-strapped construction built from heavy planks of oak, dark with age, and used the iron straps gone rusty at the edges where the oil treatment had worn away. She had seen it 100 times without ever giving it much thought. It was simply part of the barn's permanent architecture, like the posts and the rafters and the iron hooks along the north wall, something that had always been there and would presumably always be there, requiring nothing. But it hadn't been used in years. The last remnants of hardened grain inside were ancient enough to be archaeological, compressed into a solid mass at the bottom that had the texture of old clay. She needed to move it to access the wall behind it, where she could see water damage in the boards that needed to be assessed. It was too heavy to slide in one piece, so she began to empty it, scooping out the petrified grain with a flat shovel, working methodically from one end to the other, breaking up the compressed mass with the blade and shoveling it into the wheelbarrow she had positioned alongside. The work was dusty and graceless and produced no satisfaction except the steady decrease of the bin's weight. It was exactly the kind of task Walter would have attacked without complaint, and she went at it in the same spirit. When she reached the bottom of the bin and scraped the shovel across the last of the petrified grain, her blade caught on something. Not the grain, not the wood of the bin. A gap in the floor. She stopped, set the shovel aside, knelt down and brushed the remaining grain away with her bare hands, working methodically from the center outward. And that was when she saw it, a slight depression in one of the floor planks and set into that depression, almost invisible against the dark grain of the oak, a small iron ring. It was the size of a man's thumb, flush-mounted, blackened with age and deliberate with design. This was not the casual ironwork of a barn fitting or a floor anchor. It had been machined to sit flush, to disappear into the wood, unless you were looking for it with your hands as well as your eyes. Cora sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. Flint appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him move across the barn. He could be extraordinarily quiet when he chose to be, which she had always attributed to some inherited instinct from whatever working dog ran in his bloodline. He stood close beside her now, his body warm against her arm, his nose working the air near the floor. A low sound moved through his chest, not a growl, not quite, not the sound of threat or alarm, but something more concentrated. The sound a person makes when they are paying very close attention to something they do not yet understand. "Easy," she murmured. She reached down and hooked 2 fingers through the iron ring. She pulled. The plank lifted, not with the reluctant, splintering creak of something rotted or accidental, not with the resistance of wood that had settled and swollen over years of neglect, but with the smooth, deliberate, well-maintained precision of something engineered. It was hinged. It had always been hinged. The board swung upward on its iron pivot with a movement so controlled it could only have been the result of careful design and regular use. And what rose to meet her was not the packed dirt foundation she had expected, the ordinary earth beneath a barn floor, but a square of deep breathing darkness. A trap door. The air that came up from it was unlike anything in the hot barn. In the suffocating weight of the July heat, it arrived like a message from a place that operated by different rules, cool and still, and carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and dry stone, something ancient and undisturbed, something that had been sealed and maintained and kept ready. It was the smell of a place that had been tended in secret for a very long time. Cora did not move for almost a full minute. She simply knelt at the edge of that darkness and breathed and felt the coolness move over her face and forearms, like water, and tried to understand what she was looking at. The trap door was roughly 3 feet square. Inside its frame, bolted to the rough stone wall at a careful angle, was a ladder. Heavy, solid, built from thick oak rungs, set into iron-banded side rails, each rung worn smooth at the center from years of use. Not occasional use, not the use of someone who descended once a season to check on things, but the regular habitual use of someone who had been down there often and for a long time. The ladder descended about 10 feet before it curved out of sight around what appeared to be a stone corner. Her father had been down there. Many times he had climbed that ladder in the dark with the ease of long familiarity, and she had never known, and the knowledge of that ignorance sat in her chest like a stone she was going to have to learn to carry. She lit one of the old lanterns from the hook on the north wall of the barn. A good lantern, its reservoir recently filled, its wick trimmed with care. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. She had inherited from Walter not just his eyes and his silences, but his particular brand of composure under uncertainty, that prairie stillness that is not the absence of feeling but its compression. Everything pressing inward, controlled, waiting for a moment when it can be useful rather than merely expressive. She secured Flint with a quiet word and a hand signal. Walter had taught her the flat palm gesture that meant stay, and meant it absolutely. Flint sat. His ears were straight up, and his amber eyes did not leave her face, tracking her with the focused attention of an animal that has decided a situation requires its full engagement. She hooked the lantern to her belt, gripped the top rung of the ladder with both hands, and began to descend. The stone was cold against her palms in a way that was shocking after the heat of the barn, a cold that came from depth rather than from wind, the cold of earth that the sun had never reached. The darkness closed around her as the light from the barn above narrowed, first a rectangle, then a square, then a pale suggestion of an opening, then something smaller still. Her boots found each rung with certainty. 10 rungs. 12. The ladder curved left around a stone corner, and then it ended, and her feet found a floor packed earth worn smooth. She lifted the lantern. The light bloomed outward. Cora Holloway stood in a room, not a cellar, not a crawl space or a root storage or the simple earthen hollows that many panhandle farmers dug beneath their properties for cold storage. A room large and deliberately rectangular, its proportions too precise to be anything other than carefully planned, with a packed earth floor worn smooth by years of footfall and walls of thick, expertly laid stone that rose 8 feet to a timber ceiling, reinforced with heavy cross beams set at regular intervals. It was a space that had been built with extraordinary care over a great deal of time by someone who possessed both the skill and the patience to do it properly, who had not rushed, had not cut corners, had built each element of it to last. And it was full. Along the eastern wall stood rows of sealed wooden barrels, each one stenciled with a single word in Walter's careful, unadorned block lettering: water. She counted them in the lantern light, 14, 15, 16 in total, each sealed with fresh beeswax applied with a thoroughness that spoke of recent maintenance, the wax still faintly pale at the edges where it hadn't yet darkened with age. Along the opposite wall, shelving ran from floor to ceiling, constructed from the same heavy oak as the latter, laden with earthenware crocks, sealed tight with wax, preserved vegetables, put up in oil, dried fruit wrapped in wax cloth, salted meat in brine grain in sealed containers. Behind the shelving, neatly folded wool blankets, stacked with military precision, each fold exact, each stack, even the cedar blocks tucked between the layers to keep the moths away. Boxes of tallow candles, spare lanterns with their reservoirs filled, a tin medical kit latched shut, a small red cross painted on the lid in paint that had faded to a dusty rose. In the center of the room stood a small, efficient iron stove, its chimney pipe disappearing upward into a section of stone wall where it had been routed through a concealed flue with such care that it had become functionally invisible part of the wall structure, indistinguishable from load-bearing stone unless you knew precisely where to look. The flue, she would learn later, exited through a low rock formation nearly 100 yards from the barn, where the smoke from even a sustained fire would dissipate across open ground before it could form the column that a close observer might trace. The ventilation system was something else entirely. A series of pipes no wider than a man's arm, constructed of joined sections of iron, ran through the stone at carefully calculated angles, drawing fresh air from outside through a path so circuitous that the pipes entered the shelter from 3 different directions, ensuring that no single blockage could cut off the airflow entirely. The pipes were angled to prevent rain intrusion while maximizing draw. The air in this room, 10 feet below the surface of a Texas barn in the middle of a summer drought, was clean, breathable, cool. It had been engineered to remain that way regardless of what happened above ground. In the far corner, built directly into the stone wall with a carpenter's precision, was a small desk, a shelf wide enough for a man's forearms, and a journal with a low wooden stool set before it, its legs worn smooth from use. The desk was not empty. Stacked on it, in neat order, were 5 journals, their covers worn soft from handling, their spines cracked from years of being opened and closed in this still, cool air. Each one was dated on the front cover in Walter's hand. The earliest bore the year 1903, the latest 1934. Beside the journals, a small tin box with a brass hasp and locked, the key to which she realized with a start was the small plain key she had found on Walter's person after his death on its cord around his neck, which she had placed in the kitchen drawer without knowing what had opened. She sat down on the stool slowly, the way you sit when the ground has shifted beneath you and you are not yet certain the new surface will hold, and she opened the first journal. What she found inside was not what she had expected. She had not known what she expected, precisely some explanation, some confession, some account of what this place was and why it existed, but whatever shape that expectation had taken, it had not been this. What she found were instructions, page after page of careful, practical, methodical instruction written in Walter's precise hand. How to rotate the water barrels empty and refill on a 6-week cycle to maintain freshness, always working from east to west, so the rotation could be tracked without marking. How to inspect the wax seals on the crocks, pressing the thumb at the junction of wax and earthenware, and feeling for any give, any micro separation that indicated the seal had begun to fail. The precise schedule for cleaning the stove and checking the chimney flue for obstruction, spring and fall, always before the temperature changes that would put the stove into regular use. How to calculate caloric needs per person across 30, 60, and 90 days based on the current inventory. Diagrams of the ventilation system rendered in Walter's careful hand with arrows indicating airflow direction and notes on seasonal adjustments for the pipe angles. A detailed map of the room's contents with measurements and a restocking priority list in order of perishability. It was the record of a man who had been maintaining this place for decades with the same rigor and consistency he brought to the fields and the fences above ground. The record of someone for whom this room was not a project or an experiment, but a permanent commitment, an ongoing responsibility, taken as seriously as any other element of the farm. She read for a long time. The lantern burned steadily. Above her faintly, she could hear the soft padding of Flint's paws on the barn floor he was pacing. She realized not from anxiety, but from the particular restlessness of a dog waiting for something it has decided is important. She moved through 3 of the 5 journals before she arrived at what she was looking for, or rather at the place where it should have been and was not. Because the journals were thorough in every practical detail and entirely, completely silent on the one question that mattered above all others. Why? There was no entry that said, "I am building this because of what happened." No sentence that began with "when I was young," no paragraph that explained a fear, or described a memory, or named the wound that had driven a man to spend 30 years building a survival room beneath his barn in secret. He had written everything down except the thing that would have made sense of everything else. The journals were a map without a legend, precise, complete, and missing the single piece of information needed to understand what territory it was a map of. She turned to the last journal, the final entry. The page was dated April 3rd, 1935, 6 weeks before he died, she calculated. 6 weeks before the fever took him in the small hours of a May morning. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was shakier than his earlier entries, the letters less certain of their placement on the line, the pen pressing harder into the paper in some places, as though he needed the resistance to maintain his grip. He had been sick by then, though neither of them had known how sick. She had attributed his slowness to the heat. He had not corrected her. The entry read, "Refilled the northeast corner barrels. Seals on crocks 7 through 12 still holding. Flue is clear. Inventory at full capacity. Everything is ready." And then below that, separated from the practical record by a deliberate space, a breath. She thought a pause before saying the thing he needed to say, a single line. "When the sky turns black, you will know." That was all. Cora read the line 3 times. She sat with it in the quiet of the underground room and felt it move through her the way cold water moves through a thirsty person, filling something, changing something, answering something she hadn't known was a question. She did not know what the sky turning black meant. She did not know what she was supposed to know when it happened. But she understood in the way you understand things that live below the level of rational thought that her father had not been leaving her a riddle. He had not been speaking in code or mystery for its own sake. He had been leaving her a warning in the only language available to someone who had never found adequate words for the thing that had shaped him. She closed the journal carefully and set it back in its place in the stack. She sat in the still lamplight for a long time, not thinking in any organized way, simply being in the room, feeling its coolness, its order, its profound quiet, the evidence on every shelf and in every sealed crock of 30 years of solitary, deliberate, uncelebrated labor. A man had come down this ladder alone in the lamplight, checking seals and rotating barrels and updating his careful records while the world above went about its ordinary business and called him strange for his silences. It was Flint's bark, one sharp, alert sound from above, that finally brought her back. She climbed the ladder into the heat of the barn and the known world and stood for a moment in the flooding summer light, blinking. She did not open the locked tin box that day. She had seen it on the desk and noted it the way you note something that is meant to be approached after everything else, something that occupies a different category from the practical contents of the room and requires a different kind of readiness. The key was in the kitchen drawer. It would still be there tomorrow. She closed the trap door, moved the feed bin back over it with considerable effort, and went inside to make her lunch. In the weeks that followed, Cora's relationship with the town of Coldwater Flats underwent a quiet but significant deterioration, though. Deterioration implies a fall from something better, and the relationship had never been particularly warm to begin with. Walter Holloway had not been a social man. He had not attended the church socials with any regularity or participated in the conversations at the general store or been present at the gatherings on the courthouse steps where the men of Coldwater Flats discussed the drought and the government and the price of cattle. He had bought his supplies, done his business, and gone back to his land. Cora had grown up in the particular solitude of a child raised by someone who preferred the company of open sky to the company of rooms full of people who had given her books and taught her to read weather and shown her by example that a person's worth had nothing to do with how comfortable they made others feel in their presence. She had known the town's people by name and by face. She had attended school and church in the ordinary way of a young person growing up in a small place. But she had never been woven into Coldwater Flats in the way some people are woven into the places they live, never been part of the social fabric in a way that went deeper than proximity. Now, without Walter as even the thinnest buffer between her and the town's attention, she found herself exposed in a new way. The pattern of her days had changed visibly. Before Walter's death, she had worked the fields and tended the house and the animals in the ordinary rhythms of a farm girl, learning what she would eventually inherit. Now she spent her mornings below ground, rotating the barrels, inspecting the crocks, learning the ventilation system by touch and by the feel of the air, following Walter's journals with the focused attention of someone working from a text she is determined to master. Her afternoons she spent hauling supplies between the well and the barn, checking the water levels, making her own notes in the plain-covered notebook she had bought at Marsh's store for 50 cents. She emerged at odd hours covered in reddish-gray dust, her expression set and inward, her pace carrying the unmistakable quality of someone engaged in serious work, which was in Coldwater Flats in the summer of 1935, a quality that apparently required explanation. Harriet Voss provided the explanation that stuck. She was a tall, angular woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair, kept in a severe arrangement. In a moral authority she wore as naturally as other women wore their Sunday dresses, as though it were simply part of her woven into the structure of her requiring no particular effort to maintain. She sat on the ladies' auxiliary board and organized the church socials and possessed the particular social gift common in small towns of being able to say things that should not be said while making them sound like charitable concern. It was a Tuesday afternoon at Gideon Marsh's general store. The store was occupied by 8 or 9 people going about the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon, women buying flour and thread, 2 men near the back wall discussing the drought in the resigned tones of men who have been discussing it for 3 years without finding anything new to say about it. Old Bert Calhoun dozing in his customary corner near the pot-belly stove with his chin on his chest and his hands folded like a man at prayer. Cora had come in for lamp oil. She was making her way down the main aisle when Harriet's voice rose above the general quiet of the afternoon. "It's the grief," Harriet said, addressing no one in particular, which was how she always addressed everyone. "I've seen it before. When you're young and you lose the only parent you have left, when there's been no mother in the house for years, when it's just the 2 of you for all that time." She shook her head with the slow, sorrowing motion of someone delivering a verdict they find painful but necessary. Loss like that does something to the mind. Something that looks from the outside very much like purpose. The store had gone quiet in the particular way of small spaces when everyone is listening and no one wants to appear to be listening. "She's out there at all hours," Harriet continued, "in and out of that barn, covered in dirt halfway to sunstroke. A girl alone like that with no clear direction, no plan that anyone can make sense of." The pause she left was perfectly timed. "Her father's gone, and she's taken to living like a prairie dog." The name required no additional construction. It attached itself immediately the way names do in small towns, without malice, without ceremony, with the casual efficiency of a community, assigning meaning to something it finds uncomfortable and wants to make manageable. Dusty Cora, the prairie dog girl. She heard it first from Deke Calloway out on the main street the following Thursday. He was a young ranch hand of about 22, lean and always in motion with the kind of physical confidence that comes from never having been made to doubt himself in any serious way. He tipped his hat as she passed, an elaborate theatrical tip, the gesture of a man performing for an audience, and called out, "Keeping the dust company today, Cora." The men with him laughed. He grinned with the satisfaction of someone who has landed a joke exactly where he aimed it and said nothing else. It happened again at the feed store where one of the Garfield boys made a comment just loud enough to be overheard. At the post office where two women she didn't know well fell quiet when she entered and resumed a private conversation that had something amused in its undertone. In the alley behind Marcia's store where she loaded her wagon, where she heard her father's name spoken in a context that made the word strange sound like an explanation rather than a description. She did not respond to any of it. She had learned from Walter that the best answer to this kind of thing was continued existence. The quiet, relentless, completely unmocking fact of her own persistence. You kept working. You kept showing up. You let time do its work on the entertainment value of someone else's strangeness, and either it faded or it didn't, and either way you had still done the work that needed doing. So she kept working. The only person in Coldwater Flats who watched her without mockery was Roy Briggs, the blacksmith who operated his smithy on the western edge of Calvert Street in a low stone building that smelled permanently of coal smoke and hot iron and the particular mineral sharpness of a forge in regular use. He was a compact, serious man of about 34, with a square jaw and forearms that spoke of years of daily physical labor. He was not a man given to conversation. But Cora had noticed his gaze on several occasions, measured, attentive, carrying neither pity nor amusement, and it was different in quality from the attention she received from everyone else. It was not the attention of someone watching a spectacle. It was the attention of someone watching something they are trying to understand. She did not ask what he was trying to understand. She had enough to carry without adding other people's interior lives to the load. It was about 3 weeks into her work on the shelter on a still afternoon when the heat was at its worst and the grasshoppers were loud in the dry grass and the world seemed to have contracted to the immediate radius of what could be endured, that Cora finally allowed herself to sit still. She went to the far edge of the property where the land flattened out completely toward the horizon and there was nothing between her and the sky in any direction. She sat on the ground, not on a fence rail or a crate, but directly on the hard, cracked earth, and she let herself think about Walter Holloway in a way she had not allowed herself since the burial. Not the practical Walter, not the man of the journals and the iron ring and the decades of underground labor. The other Walter, the father she had known and not known for 18 years. He had been a man of contradictions. She was only now beginning to catalog with any honesty. Gentle with animals and silent with people. A reader, she had found his books in the house shelved with the same care he gave everything else, spines unmarked, but pages worn from being turned slowly and returned to. A man who had watched the sky with a constancy she had always attributed to the ordinary habit of a farmer reading weather, and which she understood now was something different and deeper. She admitted to herself in the flat light of that afternoon, sometimes ashamed of him. Not deeply, not in any way she had ever named or would have admitted to. But there had been moments at school socials, at church, in the company of other girls, whose fathers could talk about horses or baseball or the news without going silent mid-sentence, as though listening for something only they could hear, when she had wished he were more ordinary, more comfortable in the ordinary world, more willing to perform the social rituals that other men performed without apparent effort or cost. She sat with that admission in the heat, in the silence, and felt the particular weight of guilt that comes from understanding someone after the moment when understanding could have changed anything. The barn behind her held the answer to every question she had ever been too young or too impatient to ask him. He had been building something all along, something real and serious and immense down in the dark, where no one could see it or question it or diminish it with the opinions of people who hadn't seen what he had seen. He had been working all those years while the town decided what to make of his silences. He had been down in the lamplight alone checking seals. She still didn't know what he had seen. The journals had given her the architecture of his preparation, but not the memory that had made it necessary. That lived somewhere before the first page of the earliest journal in the years before 1903, in something that had happened when he was still young enough for it to reshape the entire direction of his life. She went back to the barn. She retrieved the key from the kitchen. She descended into the shelter and crossed to the small locked tin box on the desk. The key fit with the smooth certainty of a thing designed for a single purpose. Inside the box, his spare spectacles folded in a soft cloth. A whetstone for his knives, its surface worn concave from years of use in the same practiced motion. And at the bottom, face down, a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling its surface, protected by a square of thin cloth laid over it. She turned it over. A woman, young perhaps 20, with dark hair pinned loosely and eyes that held a quality Cora recognized the moment she saw it, that same watchful stillness, that same quality of seeing more than was being said, that same sense of a person who observes carefully and speaks only when it matters. The woman's mouth held the suggestion of a smile that hadn't quite arrived, or perhaps of a word she was deciding whether to say. There was a gentleness in her face that was also, she thought, a kind of strength, the gentleness of someone who has made peace with difficulty without being diminished by it. Cora had no memory of her mother. The fever had taken her before Cora was old enough to form memories that would hold. She had only Walter's occasional fragmentary offerings. She had your eyes she liked, early mornings she could name every grass on the panhandle by its seed head, and now for the first time a face. A real face, not a description of one. She held the photograph with both hands and looked at her mother for a long time, memorizing the details. The way you memorize things you understand may not be available to you again. Then she turned the photograph over. On the back, in Walter's handwriting, not the careful block lettering of the journals, but something older and more personal, the script of a younger man writing something. He was only just finding words for 2 lines. She pushed me into the cellar and covered the door with her own body. I will not forget. I will not fail. Cora read the lines and held them. She read them again. She sat in the cool underground stillness with the photograph in her lap and felt the 2 sentences arrange themselves in her mind, fitting themselves against everything she had read in the journals and everything she had seen in this room, and something that had been incomplete began slowly to become whole. She pushed me into the cellar. There had been a cellar before this one, before the stone walls and the water barrels and the iron stove and the ventilation pipes and the 30 years of careful maintenance before all of it. There had been a simpler cellar somewhere on some property that no longer existed in any form she could visit, and someone had pushed a boy into it, had gotten him down the ladder, and then had covered the door with her own body. The woman in the photograph was not Cora's mother, or she was Cora's mother in the sense that Walter had loved her and written her name nowhere in the journals, had kept her image in a locked box in the deepest, most private place he possessed. But the woman who had covered the cellar door with her body had been Walter's mother, his grandmother. The woman who had run across a yard with a child's hand in hers, while some sky she could not imagine went black above them. I will not forget. I will not fail. She set the photograph carefully in her lap and looked around at the room Walter had built. At the water barrels and the sealed crocks and the wool blankets and the iron stove and the ventilation pipes pulling clean air from 100 yards away. At the evidence of 30 years of solitary, uncelebrated labor in the dark labor that no one had seen, that no one had praised, that the town of Coldwater Flats had not known to be grateful for, and would not know until it needed it. He had turned the worst thing that had ever happened to him into this, into stone and clean air and enough food and water to keep 12 people alive through whatever the sky decided to do. He had turned a boy's survival, a survival purchased at a cost he could never stop paying, into a room that could purchase it again for people he would never meet. And no one had known. He had never asked anyone to know. She closed the tin box and left the key in the lock. She climbed back up the ladder into the barn as the afternoon light was going golden and long across the panhandle, and Flint rose from where he had been lying and pressed his solid, warm body against her legs. And she stood for a moment with her hand on his head, breathing the heat and the dust and the smell of old wood. Outside, Coldwater Flats was going about its evening. She could hear the sound of someone's supper dishes through the still air, and further away the faint music from the radio at the saloon. The ordinary sounds of a town that believed, as towns do, that the world it could see was the whole of the world. She looked west. The sky was still blue, still the flat, unremarkable blue of a Texas summer evening. Nothing threatening in it, nothing that required anything of her except the same watching she had been practicing every evening since she found the journals. She looked at it the way Walter had looked at it all those years without anyone understanding what he was looking for. She went inside to make her supper. She had work to do in the morning. The first sign came on a Monday morning in the second week of August, and it was not a color or a sound. It was an absence. The birds stopped singing, not the way birds go quiet when a hawk moves over or a storm front pushes in from the Gulf. That kind of silence has a direction to it, a traceable cause. This silence was different in kind. It arrived all at once, as though every living creature on the Texas panhandle had received the same wordless instruction at the same moment and simply ceased. The meadowlarks that had been filling the mornings with sound since April were gone from the fence posts, not just quiet but absent. She checked the posts where they reliably perched and found them empty. The sparrows nesting in the barn's upper rafters had clustered together in the high corners in a way she had never seen sparrows cluster, pressed against each other and against the walls, as though trying to reduce their exposure to whatever was coming from outside. Flint felt it too. He had taken to sitting at the open barn doors in the mornings with his muzzle lifted, reading the air with an intensity that was different from his ordinary alertness. This was not the attention of a dog tracking an interesting scent. This was the focus of an animal processing information that had no comfortable interpretation. Cora noticed it all and said nothing to anyone because there was no one to say it to who would receive it as anything other than further evidence of the strangeness that Coldwater Flats had already decided was her defining characteristic. She watched. The first week of the 2nd August brought the silence of the birds and the stillness of the cattle. She could see them from the high ground near the barn, a dozen dark shapes distributed across the distant field, standing motionless in the full heat of the day, with their heads hanging low, not grazing, not moving toward the water trough, just standing in the particular suspended stillness of animals that sense something approaching from a direction they cannot name. The second week brought the light. It was subtle enough at first that she understood how most people would dismiss it, a slight yellowing of the sky toward the western horizon, the kind of shift you might attribute to dust from a passing cattle drive or the ordinary haze of a drought summer. But it persisted and it deepened, and by midweek, the sun itself had changed in a way that was harder to explain away. It rose from the east as it always had, but by afternoon it had become something pale and strange, a white disk that gave heat without honest light, that hung in a sky the color of old brass and made every shadow on the ground fall at a slightly wrong angle, as though the light were arriving from a direction that wasn't quite right. Then came the taste. That was the detail that settled it for Cora, the thing she could not attribute to drought or haze or the accumulated anxiety of a summer spent alone with her father's journals. When she worked outside in the afternoons, something had settled on the back of her tongue, faint but unmistakable, a metallic trace like old coins held in the mouth, like the specific quality of air before a lightning strike multiplied by something she had no prior experience with, and therefore no name for. She doubled her pace. The mornings became a strict, sequenced routine of inspection and preparation. She worked through the shelter's inventory crock by crock, pressing her thumb against every wax seal and noting any that had the slightest give. She refilled 2 water barrels that had been partially drawn down over the preceding weeks, carrying the water from the well in the 5-gallon buckets she had placed along the path for efficiency. She tested the ventilation pipes with a damp strip of cloth held near each opening, watching the fabric move to confirm that the airflow was unobstructed. She checked the stove's damper and the fluke for any accumulation. She began carrying additional supplies into the shelter in the afternoons. Extra buckets of water staged at the base of the ladder, a second tin of lamp oil, additional matches wrapped in wax cloth against moisture. She moved her bedroll down. Not permanently, she still slept most nights in the narrow iron bed in the house, but she arranged it in the corner near the stove along with a change of clothes, Flint's water bowl and food tin, and 2 extra blankets folded neatly on the stool. She was arranging the sleeping area with the methodical calm of someone completing a task they have known was coming for a long time when she heard boots on the hard ground outside. It was a Thursday afternoon, the 3rd week of August. The stride was deliberate and unhurried, the walk of a man who has decided to go somewhere and has committed fully to the arrival. She straightened and moved to the barn's entrance, and Roy Briggs was crossing the open ground toward her. He stopped about 10 feet from the doors. He was carrying nothing. He looked at her with those measured eyes, then past her into the barn's interior, then out toward the western horizon where the yellow-gray had deepened overnight into something more troubled. A bruised, dirty amber sitting at the edge of the world, like the beginning of a wound. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked back at her. "Your father's barn," he said. "Is it ready?" It was not what she had expected. She had arranged her responses for the performance that Deke Calloway and Harriet Voss had been delivering for weeks, the tilted amusement, the insinuation of instability, the comfortable theater of a community that has decided someone is strange and finds the designation reassuring. She had no prepared response for a direct question delivered without condescension, without performance, without the implication that the question itself was a kind of joke. "Yes," she said. Roy looked at the horizon one more time. Something moved through his eyes, not surprise, not discovery, but confirmation of something already suspected. He nodded once, the decisive nod that ends a thing rather than continuing it, and turned and walked back the way he had come. She watched him until he disappeared from the property. He had asked one question, received one answer, and left. He had not explained his question or what he knew or why he had come. In another person from another relationship, it might have felt abrupt. From Roy Briggs, it felt like the deepest form of respect available to him, the respect of treating her as someone who knew what she was doing and did not need to be told what she already knew. It was the first time since Walter's death that another person had treated her that way. She went back to work. The morning after Roy's visit, she walked to Marsh's general store for a tin of lamp oil. The conversation she encountered there confirmed what she had come to understand about the limits of what Coldwater Flats was willing to consider. Deke Calloway was holding court near the counter, leaning on the glass display case with the comfortable authority of a young man who has never been made to feel unwelcome in any room. He was talking about the yellow haze with the tone of a man explaining something simple to people who are making it unnecessarily complicated. "Dust off the trail," he said with a dismissive sweep of his hand. "We get a dry spell, the cattle kick up the plains, dust it sits in the air for a week or two. Nothing a good rain won't clear." He grinned at the men around him, drawing them in. "Half the county acting like scripture's being fulfilled because the sky's a funny color. Like people around here have never seen a dry August before." The men nodded or half nodded in the particular way of people confirming what they want to believe. Harriet Voss, examining bolts of cloth at the other end of the store, added without looking up, "When a person has been through a difficult season, ordinary things can start to seem threatening. The mind looks for patterns." The pause she left was precisely weighted. It's understandable under the circumstances. No one in the store looked at Cora. She paid for her lamp oil and left. That afternoon, she walked the full perimeter of the property in the midday heat, studying the land the way Walter had studied it, with attention given equally to what was present and what was absent. The grasshoppers were gone. She had not seen one in 3 days, and grasshoppers in a Texas August were as reliable as the heat itself. Near the south fence, the prairie dog colony that had been active all summer had gone entirely underground, every mound sealed with fresh packed earth, every entrance closed as though a decision had been made collectively and executed without debate. She looked at the western horizon. The bruised amber had darkened further overnight, moving toward a deep, troubled purple at its lowest edge. Still distant, still something a person could look at and dismiss if they were inclined to dismiss things. But she could measure its progression now from day to day, the way you measure a fever that is climbing steadily toward a threshold. She went back down into the shelter and opened Walter's last journal to his final entry. When the sky turns black, you will know. She sat with the sentence and thought about knowledge, not the anxious suspicion of something approaching, not the accumulating evidence of warning signs she had been cataloging for 2 weeks, but the thing Walter had meant by knowing. The untroubled certainty of recognition. The specific quality of someone who has seen the thing before and knows it by name on its return. She was close. She could feel the knowing settling into her bones the way the cold of the stone room settled into her skin, not sudden but gradual, inevitable, replacing warmth with something harder and more permanent. She was ready for the storm. She was not ready for Deke Calloway. He came to the barn on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after Roy's visit, and everything about his arrival was unlike Roy's. He came with noise boots on gravel, a tuneless whistling, the deliberate announcement of someone who wants their presence known before it arrives. He stopped outside the open barn doors with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked at Cora with the grin that was his standard expression, the one he wore when he had rehearsed something. Still at it, he said. It was not quite a question. Cora was inspecting the barn's main door pulley mechanism. The thick rope, the iron wheel, the wooden handle for anywhere that might compromise the door's ability to close quickly and seal against pressure. She did not stop. "I've been trying to work out what it is you think you're doing out here, Cora." He said it with the tone of a man asking a genuine question, while making it clear he has already decided the answer is unflattering. Because from where most folks stand, it looks like a girl who's taken her daddy's passing a little harder than circumstances warrant and decided to cope by spending her summer in a barn. She kept her hands on the rope, checking the length for fraying. "Your father was a good man, I expect." Deke continued with the pause of someone who has found the soft place in a thing. "Strange habits, but a good man. Whatever he had going out here, though, whatever project he thought was worth all this." He made a slow survey of the barn's interior with his eyes, the deliberate look of someone performing assessment. The feed bin, she noted, sat unmoved over the trap door. His eyes passed over it without stopping. "It doesn't read like farming to me, and it doesn't look like something a girl your age ought to be spending the summer of her life on." Cora finished checking the rope. She set it down. She turned and looked at Deke Calloway with the full, unhurried attention she reserved for the horizon. "Go home, Deke," she said. "Close your shutters." He blinked. The grin wavered just slightly for a fraction of a second, the expression of a man encountering a tone he was not prepared for, and then it recomposed itself. "Is that right?" he said. "Yes." Something moved through his eyes in that moment that was not amusement and not certainty. Something real and briefly unguarded, a flicker of a feeling that the grin had not yet caught up to suppress. Then the grin returned at full strength, and he turned and walked back down the road, whistling the same tuneless song, and she watched him until he cleared the property line. Then she looked west. The purple had deepened again overnight. She stood at the barn doors and looked at it for a long moment, registering it, measuring it against what she had seen yesterday and the day before that. She went inside and began the final preparations. She knew every task. She knew the order and the weight and the sound of each one. She filled 4 more buckets from the well and carried them into the shelter. She checked the stove one final time, flew firebox damper, and found everything sound. She confirmed the lamp oil reserves enough for 4 days of sustained light from 3 lanterns simultaneously. She arranged the blankets in the sleeping configuration she had planned 2, here, 3, there, the stack of reserves near the stove, with the calm of someone who is not pretending. The thing is not coming, is not performing, is simply calm. She thought as she worked about who else might come, not with sentiment, with logistics. How many could the shelter hold? 12 adults with manageable discomfort, 14 or 15 if children were included. Was the water sufficient? For 12 people across 48 hours, yes, with room. For 72 hours with careful rationing. Was the food adequate? More than adequate. Walter had stocked for 90 days of single occupancy. For 12 people across 3 days, the inventory was more than sufficient. She had not told anyone about the shelter. She had thought about it and had not been able to construct a version of that conversation that ended usefully. The information would not have been received as information. It would have been received as additional evidence of the grief-altered mind that Harriet Voss had already diagnosed and the town had already accepted as the most reasonable explanation for her behavior. So she had not tried to explain. What she did instead on her last trip between the well and the barn that evening was leave the barn doors unlatched. It was a small thing, an invitation that looked like nothing at all to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. The doors were heavy enough to stay where they were left without wind taking them. They would remain slightly open, easy to push from outside, easy to pull from within for whoever came, whenever they came, if they came in time. It was the most she could do. The sky broke on a Tuesday. It did not break gradually with the extended overtures of an ordinary storm. There was no polite announcement. One moment the western horizon held that deep, troubled purple she had been tracking for 2 weeks. And then the purple ceased to be a horizon at all because the thing that had been gathering at the edge of the world was no longer gathering. It was moving. Cora saw it from the high ground near the barn at 2 in the afternoon. What came toward Coldwater Flats was not a cloud. The word implies something that belongs to the sky, something atmospheric, something that passes and leaves the sky behind it unchanged. What came was a wall, a solid roiling wall of black earth thousands of feet high, the full depth of the sky filled with compacted dust and stripped topsoil, and the debris of a decade of drought moving at 60 miles an hour across the flat panhandle with the absolute indifference of a geological event, which is precisely what it was. The Black Blizzard. Walter had used the term in his journals without elaboration the way you use a word for something that doesn't require adjectives. She understood now. Some things arrive and speak for themselves. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took her to get from the high ground to the barn. She felt it on her skin like cold water. Sudden total, as though the air had been exchanged for a different substance. The quality of the light changed. As the wall advanced, the brass yellow afternoon going to bruised gray, and then within minutes to a darkness unlike any darkness she had a prior reference for. It was not the darkness of night or storm cloud. It was darkness with mass and substance, and a sound still distant, but approaching that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. A low, grinding roar that was not thunder, not wind, in the ordinary sense, not anything that existing language had been designed to describe. She was inside the barn and pulling the heavy doors shut before the first gust arrived. The impact when it hit was like a collision with something solid, not wind, not weather, but mass. The entire structure of the barn shuddered from floor to ridge timbers, groaning under forces they were not designed to resist, cross beams, flexing the whole massive body of the building, absorbing the blow through sheer accumulated weight. The sound inside became something beyond sound. A physical presence occupying the air, like it vibrating in her chest cavity and behind her eyes filling the space completely. The air inside the barn filled instantly with dust, so fine and so dense that the lantern she lit cast light only a few feet in any direction before the darkness swallowed it. Flint pressed against her leg, his whole body trembling. She put her hand on his head. The warmth of him was an anchor. "It's all right," she said, though she could barely hear herself over the roar. "It's all right." She moved to the trapdoor. She found the iron ring by feel. She had rehearsed this without knowing she was rehearsing it every time she had descended into the shelter in the preceding weeks, every adjustment of position, every practiced movement in the dark. She lifted the board. The cool, clean air rose around her face and she breathed it in and felt something steady itself inside her. She was starting down the ladder when Flint's head came up sharply. One bark. Clean and alert, cutting through the roar, with a clarity that seemed almost impossible given the noise surrounding it. She stopped with her hands on the top rungs and listened. There, beneath the grinding roar, beneath the scream of wind through every joint and seam and crack in the barn's boards, a sound that was unmistakably human, irregular and desperate, not the rhythm of someone knocking, but the rhythm of someone who is afraid. Fists on wood. Someone was at the barn doors. She stood at the top of the ladder with the cool air rising around her and the trap door open in the clean darkness below. And she was still for a moment. She thought about Walter's final entry. She thought about the clean air waiting below. She thought about Harriet Voss's careful cruelties and Deke Calloway's practiced grin and 2 months of being Coldwater Flats' most convenient object of pity and dismissal, all of it pressing against the same moment requiring a decision. She thought about the photograph. She pushed me into the cellar and covered the door with her own body. She climbed back up. She crossed the barn floor through the roaring darkness with her arm over her mouth and her eyes nearly shut against the grit. She found the door mechanism by feel, the thick rope, the iron latch, the handle worn smooth by Walter's hand and hers. She hauled the nearest door inward just far enough, bracing against the pressure of the storm pushing from the other side. They fell inside, not one or two, but a cluster, stumbling, gasping, grabbing at each other and at the door frame, their faces masked in black dust and their eyes streaming. The first through was a man. She needed a moment to place, one of the Pearson family from the north end of Calvert Street, a young father, one child pressed against his chest, and his wife right behind him, gripping a second child by the wrist. Behind them, Gideon Marsh with his store apron still on, blinking against the dark. Old Bert Calhoun, moving with a speed his usual torpor had given no indication of possessing. And then Harriet Voss, her silver hair wild and blackened with dust, her fine dress shredded at the hem, her eyes, when she finally raised them to Cora's face in the inadequate lantern light, stripped of everything except something raw and necessary. And last, holding the door against the storm's pressure until everyone else was through, his face set and entirely focused on the task of completing the thing he had started, Roy Briggs. He shoved the door shut behind him and held it while the wind pressed back. Then he turned and found Cora in the darkness, and the understanding that passed between them required no words. He had come to the barn 3 days ago and asked one question and received one answer, and he had remembered that answer when the wall came down. He had led them here. Cora counted in the inadequate light. 11 people, including 3 children. The 2 youngest children had their faces pressed into their mother's coat. She crossed to the trapdoor without a word. She lifted it. The warm glow of the lantern she had left at the bottom of the stairs rose up into the barn's darkness like something from a different and better world. And the cool, clean air came with it. Roy Briggs looked at the trapdoor. He looked at Cora. Something moved through his face that was not surprise, confirmation perhaps of a suspicion held long enough to have become a kind of knowing. He moved to the ladder first, descended several rungs, and reached up for the nearest child. One by one they went down. Harriet Voss stopped at the edge of the trapdoor. She looked down into the warm light below, and then she looked at Cora, and whatever she had organized to say, whatever word or phrase she had assembled in the chaos of the last hour, dissolved before it reached her mouth. She simply looked. Then she descended. Cora brought Ed Flint down, last guiding his paws with both hands, while he scrambled with rather more dignity than the situation required. She pulled the trapdoor shut above them. The roar of the storm became a low, deep rumble, contained present but manageable, something the stone could hold at a distance. The air in the shelter was clean and cool and still. 11 people stood in the warm light of several lanterns and looked at what Walter Holloway had built, and the silence that settled over them was the silence of people confronting something that had no precedent in their experience. A room that had no right to exist in the terms of the world they thought they understood, prepared by a man they had never tried to understand, present at precisely the moment when it was the only thing standing between them and what was happening above. Cora moved to the nearest water barrel and filled the ladle. She crossed to where the youngest child stood, pressed against her mother's leg, her face still buried in her mother's coat. She crouched down to the child's level and waited. After a moment, the child looked up. Her eyes were red from the dust. Her small face was streaked with it black against her pale skin. Cora held out the ladle. The child took it with both hands and drank. The shelter held them the way the earth holds roots, from below, from all sides, without asking anything of them, except that they stay. That was how it felt in those first minutes after the trap door closed above them, as though the room itself had accepted the 11 people who had fallen into it, had incorporated them into its quiet, had drawn them down into the particular piece of a place built specifically for this moment. The storm above was constant, audible present, a deep, grinding rumble that traveled through 10 feet of stone and packed earth and arrived in the shelter as something the body could process without the specific terror of exposure. It was still frightening, but it was a fear that allowed thought, allowed breath, allowed the ordinary human functions that the open chaos above had suspended. Cora worked. She moved through the shelter the way she had moved through every task for the preceding 2 months, without hurry, without waste, with the quiet authority of someone who has internalized a system until it no longer requires deliberate thought. She knew this room. She knew the location of every supply, the weight of every barrel, the contents of every crock. She had spent the summer learning it the way you learn a second language, in a country where it is the only language spoken, by immersion, by necessity, by the accumulation of daily practice, until comprehension becomes reflex. Blankets, first the wool ones from the cedar-smelling stacks against the eastern wall. She carried them to the children and to old Bert Calhoun, who had lowered himself onto a wooden crate near the stove and was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She lit the iron stove, with the matches from the tin on the desk shelf nursing the flame from small kindling to a steady burn, before she adjusted the damper and moved on. She opened one of the earthenware crocks preserved peaches, their sweetness rising into the cool air like a message from a different season, a reminder that the world above had not always been what it currently was, and brought portions to the children in the small tin cups from the lower shelf. She refilled the ladle from the barrel and moved it around the circle of adults. No ceremony, no commentary. Water offered and accepted, the most fundamental transaction available. Roy Briggs had positioned himself near the base of the ladder, his back against the stone wall, his arms loose at his sides. He was the only person in the room who seemed to understand, without being told, that the most useful thing he could do in these first minutes was stay out of Cora's way and be available if something specific was needed. He watched her move through the space with an expression that contained, she thought, something very close to recognition, as though he were watching something confirm itself that he had suspected without being certain of. The others were in various states of shock, each one different. Gideon Marsh sat on the earthen floor with his store apron still tied around his waist, and his hands pressing flat against his knees, staring at the shelving along the western wall with an expression that moved gradually from pure disbelief into something more complicated. A grief that was not for himself, she thought, but for his own failure of imagination. He had been in this town for 20 years, and he had thought he understood the inventory of what it contained. He had not understood it. The evidence of that was arranged with perfect care on every shelf around him. The Pearson family had organized themselves in the corner nearest the stove, the children now wrapped in wool blankets and beginning, with the extraordinary resilience of children, to show signs of recovery. The younger girl had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder within 20 minutes of descending the ladder. The older child, a boy of perhaps 7, was looking at the water barrels with the focused curiosity of someone converting fear into inquiry, which was, Cora thought, one of the most useful things a person of any age could do with fear. Bert Calhoun had stopped shaking. He sat with his ancient hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed in the stillness of someone who has decided to let what is happening simply happen without requiring himself to have an opinion about it. Whether he was praying or resting or simply grateful to be below ground in a room with clean air, she couldn't say. Perhaps all three. Harriet Voss sat apart. She had chosen a position against the western wall slightly removed from the others, and she sat there with her hands in her lap and her silver hair still loose and blackened with dust, and she looked at the room. Not at any single element of it, but at the whole of it, sweeping her gaze slowly along the rows of sealed supplies, the engineered flue disappearing into the stone above the stove, the ventilation pipes positioned at their careful angles, the neatly stacked blankets, infilled lanterns, and tin medical kit with its faded cross. She looked at all of it with an expression that Cora chose not to interpret. There was too much to do. Deke Calloway sat near the foot of the ladder. He had not spoken since descending into the shelter. His face in the warm lantern light held none of the expression she was accustomed to seeing there. The ready grin, the practiced ease, the performance of someone who has never been uncomfortable enough to drop the act. What remained without those things was something younger and considerably less defended. He sat with his knees drawn up and his arms around them, and he looked approximately 15 years old. The younger Pearson child began to cry softly in her sleep, a small, rhythmic sound, the kind that comes from a dream that frightens without waking. Deke looked at the child. Something moved through his face, a shift, a decision made without apparent deliberation. He unfolded himself from his position at the base of the ladder and crossed the shelter slowly, and he crouched down near the sleeping girl and began without being asked to hum. It was tuneless and unpracticed and entirely without self-consciousness, and the child's crying eased within a minute and then stopped entirely. He stayed where he was. He kept humming quietly for the child who could no longer hear him. Cora saw it. She moved on. The hours passed in the slow, unmoored time of underground spaces where natural light is absent and temperature is constant, and the ordinary markers by which the body tracks duration become unreliable. Above them, the storm continued its work. They could measure its intensity by the shuddering that moved through the stone at intervals, as though something large were striking the earth above. Once a sound reached them through the flue that was sharp and percussive, a crack followed by a low grinding collapse, and the shelter went absolutely still until the stillness eased and the room breathed again. No one asked what the sound had been. They would know soon enough. It was Roy Briggs who broke the larger silence, and he did it the way he did everything, without theater, without preamble, in the quiet voice of someone contributing to an atmosphere rather than commanding an audience. "I knew Walter Holloway for many years," he said. The room's quality of attention changed without any physical movement. It gathered, drew inward, found a new center. He came into the smithy twice a year for repairs, spring and fall regular as the seasons, plow work, harness fittings, pump parts. Roy's voice was even unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who is precise with language because he is sparing with it. He didn't talk. Most visits, the whole transaction, would complete with fewer words than I'm using right now. That was fine by me. Some men talk, some men don't. The ones who don't aren't necessarily saying less. Above them, the storm rumbled on. The lanterns burned with steady, unwavering flames in the still managed air. One night, maybe a dozen years back, he stayed late. The repair was complicated. A cracked drive wheel on his water pump needed to be recast from scratch. Took longer than either of us expected, and by the time it was done, it was past 9 and the sky outside was full dark. He sat on the low stool I keep near the forge and watched me work. Roy paused, assembling the next part with care, setting each piece where it needed to go before moving to the next. I don't know exactly what made him say it. Maybe the dark, maybe just the hour late enough that a man's ordinary defenses get tired and some things come up that don't come up otherwise. He looked at the shelves, at the long rows of sealed crocks, in the stacked barrels, in the carefully maintained evidence of Walter's decades of solitary preparation. He told me about a storm, one from when he was a boy, 1878. The room was completely quiet except for the muted roar above and the soft, even breathing of the sleeping Pearson child. He said the sky went black at noon. He'd been in the old barn, not this one, the one that stood here before he built this barn, and his mother had come running and taken his hand and run with him across the yard to the root cellar. He said she moved in a way he'd never seen her move before and never saw again, like running was the only thing left in the world. She got him inside, got him down the ladder, and then she covered the door. Roy stopped. Cora had set down what she was holding. She stood near the stove with her hands at her sides. He said when he came up 2 days later, she was still there. She hadn't moved from the door. The storm had taken everything above ground. The barn, the house, two of his sisters who hadn't reached the cellar in time. Something had shifted in Roy's voice, not the volume or the pace, but the weight of it, as though the words had grown heavier in the time it took to speak them. He was 10 years old. The sound Harriet Voss made was involuntary, a breath drawn in too sharply and not released. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Her eyes, when they opened, were bright. He told me that once, Roy continued. Just the once, that one late night in the smithy. Then he picked up his pump wheel, settled what he owed, said goodnight and walked home. He never mentioned it again. He was looking at the room now, taking it in the way you take in something you are trying to fully comprehend. He didn't want anyone feeling sorry for him. He just didn't want it to happen to anyone else. The room breathed. Deke Calloway raised his head from where he had been sitting with the sleeping child. In the lantern light, his face was the face of someone who has been handed a weight and is experiencing for the first time his true mass. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Whatever he had reached for, he couldn't find it. He lowered his head. Harriet Voss had not moved from the western wall, but the rigidity she carried through Coldwater Flats like a structural element, the precise architectural posture of civic authority had gone out of her. She sat as though the bones had rearranged themselves into something less defended, something that had set down what it had been carrying. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was wet. Cora walked to the desk in the corner. She opened Walter's last journal to his final entry. She had been to this page many times in the preceding weeks, enough times that the book opened to it without searching the spine knew where to fall. She looked at the page for a moment at her father's handwriting, slower and harder pressed than his earlier entries, the writing of a man who was ill and knew it and was finishing what needed to be finished. She began to read. October the 9th, 1878. Her voice was clear and steady. The sky turned black at noon. I was 10 years old. My mother came to the barn where I was working, and she took my hand and she ran with me across the yard. She ran the way I had never seen her run before, like the running was the only thing left in the world. She got me to the cellar. She got me down the ladder. The last thing I saw before the darkness was her face above the door, looking down at me, and she said something. I have tried all my life to remember the exact words, and I cannot, but I know what she meant. I know what she was saying. She paused. In the shelter's quiet, she could hear Flint's breathing from where he lay near the stove, his great gray and amber side rising and falling in the steady rhythm of an animal at rest. When I came up 2 days later, the barn was gone. The house was gone. My father and my sisters were gone. My mother was on top of the cellar door. She had covered it with her own body and she had not moved. I do not know how to write about this in a way adequate to the fact of it. I have tried many times. I cannot. She weighed 112 pounds, and she held that door against a storm that took everything above ground. And when I opened it from inside and she fell away from it, the sky above me was as clear and blue as I have ever seen it. Cora lifted her eyes from the page for a moment. She looked at nothing in particular. Then she returned. I have asked myself every year of my life since that day what I owe to that fact, what the obligation is, what it looks like in practice, not as a feeling, not as a memory held privately, but as a daily physical concrete act in the world. I think I have my answer. It is not elegant, and it is not a monument, and it will not carry my name. It is barrels of water and sealed crocks and clean air and a warm stove in the dark. It is a ladder and a door and enough room for the people who need it. It is my mother's act performed in advance at a distance for people I may never meet. I do not need them to know. I only need it to be there. She closed the journal. The silence that followed was the deepest the shelter had held. Not the silence of emptiness or discomfort, but the silence of a room full of people who have just received something they did not know they needed and are not yet certain how to hold. Deke Calloway was the first to make a sound. It was not a word. He pressed his face into his hands, and his shoulders moved once sharply, and then he was still. He kept his face hidden for a long time. No one looked at him directly. It was the only courtesy they could offer, and they offered it completely and without discussion. Harriet Voss had not moved from her position against the western wall. Something in her face had changed in the time Cora had been reading. Not a sudden change, but a gradual one. The slow rearrangement of features long held in a particular configuration into something more open. She looked at the journal in Cora's hands, and then she looked at the room, and then she looked at something that was not present in the room but that she was seeing clearly for the first time. She spoke to the journal, not to Cora alone, to the journal, and to the man who had written it, and to the room he had built, and to the decades he had spent alone in the lamplight, maintaining it while the town above decided what to make of his silences. "I called him strange," she said. Her voice was stripped of its usual precision, carrying none of the careful calibration she brought to public speech. "In the store, at the socials, when I didn't think he could hear." She stopped. She shook her head once, a small, private motion. "I said things I believed were true because I had never considered whether I understood what I was seeing. I had not tried to understand what I was seeing. I had simply decided." No one in the room spoke. "He was the best man in this town," Harriet Voss said, "and we left him alone in it." Roy Briggs, against the wall with his arms at his sides, looked at the floor. His jaw was set and his eyes were quiet, and he added nothing because there was nothing to add. In the hours that followed, the shelter settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the stunned quiet of arrival, but something more habitable, a space with shared rhythms and shared purpose. The Pearson children woke and ate and were curious about the ventilation pipes, and Cora explained the system to the older boy with the same patient precision Walter had brought to everything, not simplifying it, but giving him the real information, treating his curiosity as something that deserved a real answer. Roy helped redistribute the water supply on the schedule Cora established, filling cups and passing the ladle without being asked to. Gideon Marsh, who had said almost nothing since his descent, eventually rose from the earthen floor and began quietly organizing the empty cups and utensils near the water barrel. A small act self-assigned, and Cora accepted it without comment. Deke Calloway remained with the Pearson children through most of the first long night. The younger girl had attached herself to him with the complete arbitrary trust of small children, climbing into his lap and falling back asleep there. And he submitted to this with a patience and gentleness that Cora observed from across the shelter with attention. People revealed themselves in difficulty. Deke Calloway, stripped of his audience and his performance, and his practiced grin turned out to contain something she had not known to look for. On the second night, with the storm still grinding above them, somewhat reduced but not finished, the rumbling lower and less frequent, but the occasional shudder still moving through the stone, Harriet Voss came and sat near Cora at the small desk. She sat without the careful social positioning of someone making a visit. She simply sat on the low stool beside the desk, and for a while she was quiet, looking at her hands. Then he used to come to the ladies' auxiliary meetings every October to collect his order from the Fall Preserve Exchange. He never stayed. He'd come in, pay what he owed, collect his jars, and leave before the social portion of the evening. I always thought he was being dismissive, that he considered himself above what the rest of us found worth doing. She paused, still looking at her hands. It never occurred to me that he might simply have been in a hurry to get back to this, that the jars he was picking up were for down here, that he was restocking. Cora said nothing. "He was bringing home what he needed," Harriet said, "and going back to work." "Yes," Cora said. Harriet looked up. Her eyes were dry now, but the rawness in them had not gone. "You knew before the storm. You knew it was coming." Cora considered how to answer honestly. "I knew something was coming. The journals taught me what to watch for. I can't say I knew exactly what it would be," she paused. "But I was ready." "He made you ready." "He made it ready. He just didn't know it would be me who used it." Harriet absorbed this slowly. She looked around the shelter one more time, one last accounting of what was here, what it meant, what it had cost to build. "He made it for the town, didn't he? Not for himself. For whoever needed it," Cora said. That's what the journal says. People he might never meet. Harriet Voss nodded. She sat a while longer in the quiet, and then she rose and returned to her place against the western wall, and she slept. Cora sat alone at the desk with Walter's journals and her own plain notebook and the warm, steady light of the lantern, and for a moment she allowed herself to sit with the feeling she had been moving past all day, the feeling she had been putting aside because there was too much to do to give it room. She had been ashamed of him once. She had wished in the small and ordinary way of a young person who does not yet understand what they are looking at that he were more comfortable in the world of other people. That wish lived in her now as a weight she would need to learn to carry differently, not as guilt, which was too simple, but as something more complicated, as the cost of having been young, as a debt she could not pay directly but could redirect. She could do the work. She could maintain what he had built. She could be in the world above ground, the thing he had been unable to be visible, present, available to the community he had spent his life quietly protecting. She could be his continuation. She closed the journals and opened her own notebook and began updating the inventory, noting what had been consumed, calculating what needed to be replenished, beginning the list of restocking priorities for when they returned to the surface. It was quiet work, orderly work, the kind of work that made sense of itself through its own completion. Above the storm continued to diminish. The breaking of it was gradual, not an ending, but a thinning. The grinding roar losing mass and urgency over the course of several hours, becoming a sustained moan, then something that was merely wind, merely weather, the ordinary atmospheric voice of a Texas morning after a hard night. The deep periodic shuddering ceased. The stone walls settled. Flint's ears, which had been held slightly raised for 2 full days, came down. Roy Briggs was the first up the ladder. He pushed the trapdoor open slowly, and a light came down into the shelter. Pale thin filtered through a haze of suspended dust still in the air, but genuine, unambiguous daylight arriving from the east where it had always come from. He pushed open the barn doors, and they came out one at a time, blinking, stepping into a world that occupied the same geography as the one they had left and was almost unrecognizable in every other way. Cold water flats lay beneath a blanket of black dust 2 and 3 feet deep, in places smoothed and shaped by the wind into long, soft dunes that dissolved the distinctions between road and yard property and filled the world that people had built and the earth that had always regarded that construction with indifference. The general store had lost its false front, the wooden facade stripped to bare timber. 2 houses on the north end of the main street had lost their roofs entirely. The church stood intact but buried to its windowsills. Harriet Voss's garden, which she had maintained with a fierce and very public pride, was simply gone, not damaged but erased, the beds and borders indistinguishable from the surrounding blackness. They stood in the pale morning light and looked at it, and no one spoke for a long time. Flint sat at Cora's feet and surveyed the altered landscape with his amber eyes, and whatever he concluded about it he kept to himself. It was Deke Calloway who moved first. He stood at the edge of the group, slightly apart in the younger and less defended version of himself that the shelter had produced, and he looked at the drifted dust around the barn and the buried road and the people around him. He took a breath. "We clear the Holloway place first," he said. His voice was even and practical and carried no performance whatsoever. "Then we work outward from there." No one argued. No one questioned the logic of the sequence. Roy Briggs walked to what remained of his smithy and came back with 3 shovels, all that could be found quickly. The Pearson father took the first shift. Gideon Marsh took the second. Roy worked without stopping, moving through the drifts with the efficient economy of a man accustomed to sustained physical effort. Deke worked beside Roy through most of the morning, matching his pace. At one point, Roy stopped and looked at him with a brief, assessing look. The look of a man taking a measure and finding it sufficient, and then nodded once and went back to work. Deke went back to work. Harriet Voss did not shovel. She was clear-eyed enough about her capabilities to know that was not where her usefulness lay. What she did instead was organize, which was the skill she possessed in the same deep, internalized way that Cora possessed the shelter's inventory. Within 2 hours of emerging from the barn, she had established a cooking fire in the clear ground behind the Holloway barn, had sent the older Pearson Boyd at a run to 3 neighboring properties to spread word that the barn was open and people were gathering, and he had produced from the shelter's crock supply enough preserved food to feed 20 people a proper breakfast. She did it without announcing her intentions or asking permission, simply beginning, and the people around her adjusted to accommodate the movement of someone who knew what she was doing, and things got done. Cora watched at her from across the yard and recognized something in it that she had not expected to recognize: the same quality of purposeful motion, the same absence of wasted effort, the same fundamental assumption that work is its own justification and requires no announcement. She had disliked Harriet Voss for 2 months. She found standing in the pale morning light, with dust still in her hair, that the feeling had vacated itself without quite being replaced by its opposite. What was there instead was something more complicated, something that would require time and more information before it resolved into a name she trusted. By midday, families were arriving from neighboring properties, people who had weathered the storm in root cellars and stone buildings and were emerging now into the same altered world, gravitating toward the sound of other people working. The story of the barn traveled with each new group, already changed slightly in the telling, already acquiring the modifications that stories accumulate when they pass through people who are still processing what they mean. Some of what arrived was accurate, some was approximate, but the essential truth held in every version: Walter Holloway had built something beneath his barn. His daughter had kept it, and when the black wall came down on Coldwater Flats, there had been a place to go. By the second day, the story had done what stories do when they carry genuine weight. It had stopped being a story and started being a fact, something that had happened and would continue to have happened for as long as anyone who had been there was alive to carry it. The shelter existed. Walter Holloway had built it. Cora had maintained it and opened the barn doors and put a ladle of clean water in the hands of a frightened child in the dark. Those were facts. They were not revisable. It was on the evening of the second day after the storm that Roy Briggs descended into the shelter and found Cora at the desk. She was updating her notebook, the consumption from the past 2 days, the restocking list in priority order, the adjustments to the rotation schedule that the partial drawdown of the water barrels required. It was quiet work that made its own sense, and she was glad of it. She heard Roy on the ladder and looked up as he came around the corner. He was carrying something, a leather document wallet, flat and rectangular, the kind used by lawyers in county offices. Its surface was dusty from wherever it had been, but the leather itself was undamaged, the brass clasp intact. He crossed the room and set it on the desk beside her notebook. "Found it this morning," he said, "in the tin box. In a false bottom, there's a thin panel at the base that lifts out. Found it when I was cleaning the box out." Cora looked at the wallet. She had opened the tin box several times. She had not known about a false bottom. She reached for the wallet. Roy stepped back and gave her room the same respectful distance he had maintained since the beginning, the uncrowding quiet of someone who understands that certain moments belong to the person in them. She unfastened the brass clasp. Inside, protected by the leather and the cool dryness of the shelter, was a single folded document. She unfolded it carefully. A land deed, the Holloway homestead house barn outbuildings, and the 160 acres surrounding them, made out in Cora Holloway's name, executed and notarized 3 years before Walter's death, signed by a county clerk in Amarillo, whose stamp was clear and unambiguous in the lower right corner. Walter had not left this to chance, had not trusted the uncertainty of dying without a will, had not assumed the law would treat a young woman fairly in the absence of documentation, had not relied on the goodwill of a county that did not always show goodwill toward people who existed on the margins of its attention. He had done what he did with everything prepared, anticipated, made it concrete and legally binding in advance, without telling anyone it was done. Cora sat with the deed in her hands and breathed. She thought about 30 years of water barrels and wax seals, about the ventilation system designed to keep 20 people breathing through a 3-day storm, about the photograph at the bottom of the locked box in the 2 lines on its back, and about a 10-year-old boy emerging from a root cellar into a blue sky with everything gone, and a woman who had been 112 pounds covering the door that had kept him alive. She thought about the 57 years between that morning and the morning Walter had set pen to paper in a county clerk's office in Amarillo, and what had filled those years, what daily practical, unremarked labor had accumulated in them, what solitary purpose had structured them, what love had driven them, that could not find its expression in words, and so had built itself into stone and iron and oak. He had thought of everything, including the future he would not live to see, including her. Roy was standing near the stove with his eyes on the middle distance, present without intruding. He registered it with the county attorney as well, he said. I checked this morning before I came down. It's on record in Amarillo. The land is yours, Cora, fully and without question. It always will be. She nodded. She did not have a voice for anything more elaborate. He thought of everything, Roy said. Not a compliment, an observation delivered with the same precision he brought to everything, carrying far more than its literal meaning. He did, Cora said. She folded the deed and returned it to the wallet and placed it on the corner of the desk beside her notebook and beside Walter's journals. The 5 worn journals and the plain 50-cent notebook sat together in the lantern light, the old and the new, the inheritance and its continuation, the end of one keeping and the beginning of another. She climbed the ladder back up into the barn. The evening air was extraordinary. After 2 days underground and 2 days before that of the storm's chemistry, the air of a Texas August evening had never seemed so precisely itself warm and dry and carrying the specific scent of the panhandle that was dust and grass and distance, the smell of a place that was hard and honest about what it was and did not pretend otherwise. The sky to the west, where she had watched the horizon darken for 3 weeks, was clear. Not the unsettled yellowed clarity of the pre-storm days, but a deep, honest blue going to orange at its lowest edge, the sun descending into a horizon that held nothing threatening, only color, only the ordinary daily beauty of a sky that had finished what it came to do. Flint came and pressed his warm weight against her leg. She put her hand on his head. Behind her, Coldwater Flats was making the sounds of reconstruction, the rhythmic work of hammers' voices, planning and organizing the creak of lumber being moved, and somewhere further down the road the sound of children playing, which was perhaps the most insistent sound a community could make, the sound that insisted most forcefully on the continuation of ordinary life. Deke Holloway came out of the barn, carrying a coil of rope, and stopped when he saw her. He had been like this since the storm, careful in a new way, his earlier carefulness having been the carefulness of someone watching for leverage, this being something different. He met her eyes and held them without the practiced grin anywhere in evidence. There's a crew coming tomorrow to help with the road, he said. I told them to start on your property first. He paused. He seemed to be discovering in real time that some things are harder to say than others, and that the difficulty is not incidental, but essential. It is the measure of how much the saying costs. I should have looked at what you were doing instead of making it a joke. I should have. He gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed 2 months of mockery and the particular reversible stupidity of mistaking diligence for eccentricity. I'm sorry, Cora. She looked at him. He was not performing the apology. She had learned to tell the difference. Come back tomorrow, she said. There's work to do. He nodded. He went. Harriet Voss appeared at the edge of the property as the light was going, golden, walking with her characteristic posture, the straight spine of someone who has decided who she is and does not revisit it. Though the dress she wore was borrowed, and her silver hair had not yet been restored to its usual arrangement. She carried a covered dish, which she brought to Cora without ceremony and placed in her hands and stepped back. Supper, she said. Cora looked at her. Your father kept this town alive, Harriet said. Whether or not it deserved it, whether or not it knew it was being kept. She paused, and the precision that was characteristic of her was present in what she said next. Not the precision of social management, but the precision of someone committed to saying exactly what they mean, no more and no less. You kept it alive, too. You were not obligated to. You had no reason to open that door. I want you to know that I know that. She held Cora's gaze for a moment, a real exchange, something honest in it on both sides. Then she turned and walked back toward the road. Cora stood in the barn doorway with the covered dish in her hands and Flint at her feet and the clear sky above, and she looked out at the altered landscape of Coldwater Flats, the buried roads and damaged buildings, and the people moving through the long golden light with tools and determination, the particular energy of a community that has survived something and is deciding without announcing the decision what comes next. They were deciding to continue. That was what she saw. In the movement and the sound, and the small, insistent signs of life reasserting itself, a child's laughter, a hammer's rhythm, two men shaking hands over a plan drawn in the dust with a stick, smoke rising from a cooking fire. They were deciding that continuation was possible and worth the labor it required. Walter Holloway had believed that. He had believed it quietly and alone for 57 years, and he had expressed the belief not in words but in stone and iron and oak, in sealed crocks, in beeswax, in a ventilation system that drew clean air from 100 yards away, in a deed filed in Amarillo, and a key on a cord around his neck, and a photograph kept in a locked box in the deepest, most private place he possessed. He had believed it through every visit to the county clerk's office, and every season of solitary maintenance, and every year of the town's indifference, all of it adding up to this evening, to this clear sky, to these people moving through the light. Cora Holloway was 18 years old. She had 160 acres of sound barn, a shelter that needed restocking, and a community that had just learned something it would not easily forget. She looked up at the sky one last time, honest and clear from horizon to horizon, holding nothing back and promising nothing. The sky, the panhandle, had always offered difficult and real and entirely itself. Roy Briggs was passing on his way home, and he slowed when he saw the lantern light in the doorway and stopped. He looked at her standing in the warm light with Flint beside her and the covered dish in her hands, and he said what he said. "Your father built something that outlasted the storm." His voice was quiet in the evening air. "So did you." She looked at him. She held his gaze the way you hold something you have decided to keep. He nodded once. He walked on. She went inside to eat her supper. The people of Coldwater Flats stopped calling her Dusty Cora. They called her the Keeper,